This is a direct order. Salute me right now. That's what the general who came to visit demanded. But the royal guard's answer didn't simply go against him. It changed all he thought he understood about respect and command. Do you want to know what truly happened? Click the subscribe button and turn on your notifications for more amazing stories like these. Let's get started now. The diplomatic convoy came to a seamless stop at the entrance for visitors to Buckingham Palace. Black cars shining under the clear fall sun. The door of the second car swung open before the driver could get to it as the cars parked. Brigadier General Marcus Thornton came out quickly and efficiently, like a man who was used to doing things on his own schedule instead of someone else's. His uniform was spotless. The 4 stars on his epaulets caught the morning sun, and every medal and ribbon was in the right spot. Each crease was sharp enough to draw blood. He snarled to the younger cop, 12 minutes behind schedule already, as he rushed out of the car after him. Why did I agree to this detour when the defense conference starts in 3 hours? His voice was clipped and precise, like that of a career military guy who expected everything to be done quickly. Lieutenant Davis quickly fixed his own uniform. The ambassador thought it would be a kind thing to do, sir. The British group asked for you to be there. Thornton said again, diplomatic gestures, and the words sounded like a minor curse word in his tongue. Instead of going to what is basically an expensive museum, we might be finishing up the Baltic security briefing. He looked over the royal grounds with the careful eye of a strategist instead of the awe of a guest. A group of royal officials came up to them with friendly smiles and outstretched hands. Thornton straightened his already impeccable posture and switched into what his staff called his diplomatic mode. All of the firm handshakes and polite gestures that never quite made it to his eyes. The head official said, "General Thornton, what an honor it is to welcome you to Buckingham Palace." Thornton instantly said, "The honor is mine," even though he was still looking about. He noticed the royal guard standing still at his position, his bright red uniform standing out against the stonework of the palace. "I see that your famous guards are on duty." "Yes, General. The Queen's Guard has been stationed here for hundreds of years." Thornton interrupted, saying that keeping traditions alive is a good thing. He was already losing interest in the history lesson. In today's security climate, I've always been curious about the tactical usefulness of wearing ceremonial clothing and being in a predictable position. The official smile faded a little. "I promise you, General, that every guard is a fully trained combat soldier, even though they are only there for show." "Really?" There was courteous doubt in Thornton's voice. He spoke to his aide without looking away from the guard. "Tell the group. I'll be back with them soon. I'd like to have a better look at these soldiers in action." "Sir, the schedule will allow for a short diversion," Thornton said firmly. "Lieutenant, it's never a waste of time to do a military assessment." As the palace officials escorted the rest of the group to the official entrance, Thornton walked purposefully toward the lone guard. His road across the beautifully kept grounds like a ruler's edge, straight and unyielding royal guard. Patrick Winters saw the diplomatic motorcade coming long before it stopped. 8 years of intensive training had made his peripheral awareness almost magical. Even though he kept his eyes on the right 1,000-yard gaze, he noticed every detail of the American general who had broken away from his group and was now coming toward him with clear intent. He had just 3 weeks before pulled a compromised intelligence asset out of a dangerous scenario in Eastern Europe. This operation is still secret at the highest levels. The Queen's Guard was different from other military units because they could easily switch from active field service to ceremonial duty. The rifles they carried weren't just for show, and the men who stood guard weren't just taught to stand still. As the crowd of tourists grew, Winters noticed a distinguished older man in a tweed jacket with a military bearing watching the general approach with a knowing look. Winters instinctively thought he was a high-ranking former soldier because of how he carried himself. British troops because he didn't seem to care about the palace changing of the guard statement. The American general was getting closer now, and his face showed a mix of interest and mild contempt. Winters got ready in his mind for what experience told him was coming. Another test of his willpower. Another try to get a response. Another who didn't get that standing guard. Didn't just mean standing still. General Thornton waved away his worried aide with a quick motion. "Lieutenant, go back to the delegation. Let them know I'm doing a casual checkup." His voice made it clear that he was sure that his change in plans would be accepted without question. "Yes, sir," Lieutenant Davis said, pausing for a moment before adding, "Should I tell the British liaison officer about your inspection?" Thornton's face hardened a little. "Lieutenant, that's not necessary. As far as I know, you don't need diplomatic clearance to watch public displays." The lieutenant quickly backed away, leaving Thornton to walk up to the guard alone. Edward Blackwood, a retired British Army colonel, was one among the tourists and quickly saw the potential for problems. 30 years of duty had taught him how to identify the symptoms that military power was going too far. He walked closer, pretending to admire a plaque nearby, while keeping the conversation within earshot. "Interesting specimen," Thornton said loudly enough for tourists around to hear as he walked around the guard. "It's theatrical, but in its own way it's impressive." The lady of a young American couple whispered, "Is he allowed to get that close?" Her husband shrugged, unsure, and they both stepped back to provide space between them and what was starting to seem like a fight. Thornton finished his circuit and stood right in front of Guard Winters, intentionally blocking his line of sight. "You know that most armies assess how effective they are by what they do, not what they don't do." Thornton spoke loudly, as if he were talking to a whole room of people, instead of just one guard, an interesting distinction in culture. He leaned in a little farther to look at the guard's clothing insignia. "These ribbons show that the person has been in combat. I wonder if standing totally motionless is a good way to apply that training." Colonel Blackwood's jaw tightened as he watched the planned provocation. He drew the attention of a royal guard and offered a small nod to the situation. The cop nodded back in a quiet way and spoke into his radio. "I've commanded 3 forward operating bases," Thornton went on, speaking clearly and slowly. "I've led combat operations on 4 continents, and I've never trained my men to stand still while a superior officer talked to them." There was no doubt about how he saw himself, because of how much he talked about being better. Guard Winters stayed completely still, showing his full discipline. The only thing that moved was a ribbon on his tunic that fluttered in the wind as it blew across the royal grounds. "At ease, soldier. Your brigadier general is talking to you." Thornton's voice had the unmistakable tone of command that came from years of giving commands that were followed right away. He stood just in front of the guard, on purpose, so that the guard couldn't keep gazing straight ahead without looking through him. "Maybe they don't teach you how to be polite in the military during your training," he said, his voice getting sharper. "In genuine combat units, you have to acknowledge higher-ranking superiors. It's an important part of the chain of command." Colonel Blackwood winced a little at the words, "real combat units," knowing how offensive it would be to any Queen's Guard if they were allowed to answer. He looked around and saw a few other people who looked like they were in the military, a Dutch naval officer, and what looked like a retired Canadian regiment commander, all of whom were getting more and more worried. Thornton's voice carried across the courtyard as he said, "You see this uniform? I had to serve 2 tours in Afghanistan before I could wear it. I've seen brothers in arms die for the values you make fun of. Sir, this isn't a costume. You definitely don't understand that it's a sign of dedication." Thornton walked around the guard again, and the sound of his steady steps echoed off the castle walls. When he came back to face Guard Winters, his body language had changed a little. His shoulders were more squared up, and his chin was a little higher. Thornton spoke loudly enough for everyone in the military to hear him. "When soldiers see their superiors, they salute them. It's not just politeness. It's understanding the chain of command that keeps armies running in chaos," he said, pointing to his insignia. "These stars stand for the authority that NATO and all of its allies, including Her Majesty's Armed Services, agree on." Colonel Blackwood moved closer to a group of American tourists who were observing with an unpleasant interest. He said in a hushed voice, "The guards have a different set of rules. They answer to the crown first. Their standing orders come before even generals who come to visit. So why doesn't someone tell him that?" The American dad muttered back, "Some lessons need to be learned firsthand," Blackwood said, sounding tired and wise, like someone who had seen such things happen before. "This is exactly the problem with putting tradition above tactical reality," Thornton said, his voice becoming crisp like an order on the battlefield. "A soldier who can't adapt to changing situations is a liability. In every combat zone I've led, this kind of strict following of rules would get men killed." A few veterans in the audience looked at each other knowingly. They knew this talk was going into risky terrain, where military pride clashed with diplomatic procedure, which didn't usually end well. Thornton got even closer, and his shadow fell on the guard's perfectly clean uniform. "Let me be very clear, soldier. Just because you're in a ceremonial role doesn't mean you can ignore basic military etiquette. When a higher-ranking officer speaks to you, you acknowledge that officer. That's not British or American protocol. It's military basics. Guard." Thornton's voice rang out across the courtyard like a whip crack. "Follow this order from a brigadier general. Salute now to show your respect." Every phrase hit its mark like artillery fire, with no room for error. Everyone in the crowd held their breath. A few others who had been filming the scenario on their phones quietly dropped them, feeling uneasy about documenting what was starting to feel like a diplomatic issue. Parents brought their kids closer, while military veterans in the crowd stood up straight without thinking, responding to the clear tone of command. There was a flash of real rage in Thornton's eyes, which was dangerous. His right hand raised slowly, hovered for a time, and then came to rest solidly on the guard's shoulder. Immediate compliance is the only right thing to do when a higher-up gives you a direct order, Thornton added, his voice lowering to a frightening hush. The onlookers were shocked by the physical encounter. Colonel Blackwood took a clear stride forward, and his military presence became quite clear. "General, I must advise you." But before he could finish, Thornton kept talking, his fingers digging into the red tunic. "I get the theater tradition, soldier. What I don't get is how rude it is to a NATO commanding officer." A small boy's voice shattered the tense silence. "Mom, he's not supposed to touch the guard, is he?" The question hung in the air, innocent yet clearly expressing the boundary that had been breached. Several others afterward said that the change in Guard Winter's behavior was so perfect that it seemed almost mechanical. At one point, he stood still for a ceremony. His white-gloved hand then moved quickly and smoothly to free the general's grip on his shoulder. The move was not rude or confrontational, it was just clear. His move was precise because he had studied it for thousands of hours, and it had the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what to do. "Sir, with all due respect, touching a Queen's Guard is against the law," Winters said in a clipped, precise voice that sounded like British military authority. "I have to tell you about this violation and ask you to go back to the viewing area." You could hear the crowd's collective intake of breath when it suddenly went quiet. General Thornton's face went from commanding to shocked for a time, then quickly changed to angry. "You dare," he said. But Winters kept going with perfect military politeness that didn't let anyone interrupt. "Brigadier General Thornton, while your rank commands appropriate respect within NATO allied forces, current protocol on palace grounds establishes clear guidelines for interaction with the Queen's Guard." His gaze remained forward, still following ceremonial requirements even as he addressed the situation. Touching a guard on duty is a Class 2 security breach that needs to be dealt with right away. Thornton's cheeks turned red, but Winters kept talking with mechanical precision before he could answer. Standing Order 157 talks about how to interact with Allied military personnel. Guards will stay in their positions and keep their heads up no matter what rank the visiting military person is, because their oath is first to the crown. Colonel Blackwood came a few steps closer and spoke to Thornton in a way that showed he was a soldier. "You're absolutely right, General. The guards work directly for the monarchy, not NATO. Their rules take precedence over normal military courtesy on palace grounds. My duty is to the crown first," Winters said, and his discipline showed in every phrase he chose. That duty includes following the rules, position, and bearing set by the military, no matter what. This isn't a matter of disrespect for your rank, sir. It's a matter of absolute respect for the oath we've sworn. Captain James Edwards's voice came from behind, steady and commanding, but not aggressive. "General Thornton, I think there might be some confusion about the rules." Thornton turned around, and his military training made him look at the officer who was coming. Captain Edwards' demeanor was great. It wasn't too formal or too casual, but it was just right for a professional. His way of doing things eased the stress while still respecting everyone involved. "Captain Edwards, Guard Company Commander," he said, giving Thornton's rank a quick nod that showed he knew what it was without giving up his own authority. "I hear you've been talking to Guard Winters about the rules. Your guard broke position to talk to me," Thornton said, and his tone made it sound like this proved his earlier arguments about how stiff ceremonies may be compared to how quickly they can respond. "Yes, sir," Captain Edwards said calmly. Guard Winters followed Standing Order 157, Paragraph 3. Guards are allowed to respond with the least amount of communication and action necessary in case of physical contact or immediate security concerns. He spoke in a realistic way, not a defensive way. Captain Edwards pointed to a part of the grounds that wasn't as busy. "Maybe we should talk about this in private. General, I'd be happy to explain the historical and practical reasons why we do things this way here." Captain Edwards started talking in the calm, measured tones of someone who knows how to explain complicated customs to tourists as they walked away from the crowd. "To most people, the Queen's Guard looks like a ceremonial group, but that's only part of what they do. Each guard is from an active combat unit, the same soldiers who served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other deployments. Winters himself was in Eastern Europe last month with special reconnaissance." Thornton's face changed as he heard this news. He admitted that he had been wrong about combat veterans before. Captain Edwards acknowledged that the ceremonial aspect is additional duty, not their primary function. Their standing orders reflect this dual responsibility, keeping traditions that bind our military present to its historical origins, while also being warriors ready for action. When you spoke to Guard Winters, sir, you weren't facing ceremonial pageantry. You were facing a different command structure. His lack of response wasn't disrespect. It was following standing orders that put sovereign authority above visiting military rank. As Captain Edwards explained, Thornton's military discipline came back to him. Thornton remarked, "Years of being in charge have taught me how important it is to change my mind when new information comes to light, even if it goes against what I thought I knew. Thanks for the clarification, Captain." His tone went from angry to professional. Colonel Blackwood came up to General Thornton and offered his hand. "Edward Blackwood, formerly Colonel, 5th Royal Regiment. I served alongside American forces in the Gulf." The opening carefully stressed shared military experience rather than the current conflict. Thornton shook hands with the other person in a professional way. Blackwood added, "If I may add, General, what you saw with Guard Winters was exactly the kind of discipline that makes these soldiers so good in combat. The same focus that keeps them still for hours, lets them stay in place when the enemy is firing at them." Thornton thought about this point of view, and his tactical mind started to work on it. He agreed that it was a different application of the same discipline. "Exactly," Captain Edwards said. "A lot of our guards have moved those same skills to special operations, where patience and total control are very important. Some people think the ceremonial duties are out of date, but they build basic combat skills that work well in modern warfare." A few school kids walked by and pointed eagerly at Guard Winters, who was standing perfectly motionless. Their teacher talked quietly about the tradition and what it meant. "Tradition has its place," Thornton said, seeing the kids' interest. "But I've always put adaptability first in my command philosophy." "Yes, we do," Captain Edwards said calmly, "but adaptability can look different for different people. For us, it means keeping things the same while sending the same people to modern conflict zones, sometimes switching between those roles in the same month." Thornton considered for a moment, and then nodded. Different ways of saying the same military ideas. As they went toward the ceremony, Thornton looked back at Guard Winters and saw him in a new light. He admitted, "Your guard handled the situation with admirable restraint. Many people would have reacted more strongly to my approach," Captain Edwards said. "They're chosen as much for their discipline as for their judgment. Every day, each guard has to make dozens of quick decisions about which protocol violations need a response, which can be handled with little help, and which need immediate action." Thornton noted that combat decision-making was used in a ceremonial setting, and that professional respect slowly replaced his previous dismissiveness. While they waited for the ceremony to start, Thornton's military mind kept going over everything he had learned at the meeting. He thought about how diverse traditions are just different ways of expressing the same basic ideas: discipline, obligation, and the chain of command. Blackwood concurred. "Well said, General. The uniforms and rules may be different, but the core military values are the same in all countries and cultures." The opening notes of the ceremonial music played, letting everyone know that the guard change was coming. Thornton stood at parade rest, and without meaning to, his body language showed that he had a new respect for a military institution that was distinct from his own, but nonetheless in line with it. What does real respect look like between different military cultures? Today's example reveals that when diverse service cultures meet, understanding is often more important than authority.